Good afternoon, everybody. I hope you can all hear me well. Welcome to this webinar organized by EFCTC and Ricardo about the risk management option analysis study that has been recently launched. As you can see probably on your screen, this meeting is being recorded. The recording of the presentation part will be made available on the EFCTC website, while the recording of the Q&A session will be used to prepare a Q&A document that will also be made available on the EFCTC website. So let me start and with the presentation. I hope everybody can see it properly on their screen. First of all, as every CEFIC meeting, this one will also follow strictly competition law. This means that we will not discuss any commercially confidential information. You can see on the screen some examples of the topics that can be discussed and the ones that will be not discussed during this meeting. As I mentioned, there will be a Q&A session after the presentation from the Ricardo team. What I would like to ask you is to please use the chat to ask the your questions, because these will also help me out in preparing then the Q&A document after the webinar. So to start, who are we? So I will give a short introduction of EFCTC. The EFCTC is the European Fluorocarbons Technical Committee. We are a sector group of CEFIC, and we represent 5 companies that are producers of F-gases. So we have Arkema, Chemours, Daikin, Cora, and Honeywell. And after a project with Ricardo that we have started in the beginning of the year to conduct a socioeconomic assessment on the possible impact of a rich restriction of PFAS on the F-gas sector, we have decided to renew this cooperation and to launch an RMOA study. And I am here joined by Inge from the Ricardo team, who will give us a presentation and will explain to us a little bit about the study and then the upcoming stakeholder survey, where we would also like to request your input. Inge, please, the floor is yours, and I will share the slides.
Thanks, Elisa, and thanks everyone for attending this webinar and for taking interest in our consultation and our study. My name is Inge Kukla, and I'm a senior economist at Ricardo. I've been working for the majority of this year with EFCTC on the study on the socioeconomic assessment of the value of F-gases in the European Economic Area. And I've worked alongside a team of chemicals policy experts and chemists and other economists to develop this study. I'm going to give you some highlights of the study that we finished and on the new one that we are starting now, what we need, the information that we need to gather, and how this will translate into a consultation and the participation that is needed from you. So next slide, please, Elisa. So yeah, I'm going to give you some context of what's the scenario where we are making this study, what's the regulatory context, and then proceed to some structure of the study itself. And I'm going to move on then up to the survey, to the consultation that is going to be launched shortly, and so some sample questions on what it would look like and what we need to gather, and then to the Q&A session. Next slide, please. Next. So we were commissioned, Ricardo, by the EFCTC to undertake the regulatory management option analysis of certain fluorinated gases in the context of a proposal to restrict all PFAS. That proposal has been on the process of decision from ECHA for some time now, from last year, and that would imply the banning of the manufacture, use, and import of F-gases. Some of these F-gases have been identified as key inputs to production of a lot of applications from which you are producers. Our assessment, the regulatory management option analysis, is going to be used to support a response to the regulator, to the European Chemicals Agency, in their consultation on the proposal to restrict PFAS that includes F-gases. The extent of this restriction is not entirely defined yet. It can still change a lot along the process, and that is why we are intending to submit information in order to defend a case in which not all of the F-gases have to be restricted according to the evidence that we may gather, of course. That's not decided yet. It's not an outcome of the project that is determined before. The evidence that we gather will help us determine along a number of criteria what will be the best regulatory management options or policy, if you wish, for each of these F-gases. So we aim to find evidence on the extent of the implications of the restriction of the F-gases in scope of this study, and gather information on that with the consultation that we are launching, to use that as supportive evidence to define the best policy approach for each of the F-gases in scope. So within this study, our objectives are going to be to identify the alternatives to each of the F-gases in scope in each of their critical applications and analyze their technical feasibility, their performance, and their costs compared to the current situation in which the use of with the use of F-gases. Thanks to the contribution of all the producers and downstream users of F-gases in this consultation. We are then moving on to outline the net economic and societal benefits of the F-gases that are generated along the downstream value chain from the use of F-gases, their blends, and or their alternatives in various critical applications, as I mentioned. And your production is one of such critical applications of those F-gases. And then with all this information gathered, we will be in a position to conclude about the suitability of a restriction for each of the F-gases in scope, and be able to make some recommendation of maybe the regulatory option that is in place at the moment, that is the restriction, or an alternative option if that is deemed more appropriate according to evidence. And that might be a derogation or some others that I will be covering in more detail in a second. So the tasks that we are developing at the moment are mainly gathering data in a desk-based research, gathering data from the literature, reviewing and relevant market information, reports, etc. on F-gases and PFAS. Another key element of the data gathering activities is the stakeholder consultation. That is what I will be covering today. And with those two pillars, we are going to build the analysis of alternatives of each F-gas for each of their uses, and a socioeconomic assessment of each F-gas in each of their uses. And with that, we are going to be assessing the best regulatory management options for each of the F-gases. Next slide, please. So we're aiming to collect additional evidence to submit to ECHA as part of the restriction consultation process, as I mentioned. We conducted a similar study recently, the finalized socioeconomic assessment, that provided joint conclusions of the impacts of a restriction on a group of 10 relevant F-gases. In this study, it was concluded that without derogations of the restriction to some of the lowest global warming potential F-gases, greenhouse gas emissions could increase in comparison to the current scenario established by the F-gas regulation. Additionally, there are some concerns regarding the safety and hazard profiles of some of the identified alternatives to F-gases. So in this study, we provided joint conclusions for the whole group of F-gases. In this current one, the RMOA, we are aiming to assess in a case-by-case basis for each of the F-gases in scope the best regulatory management options. So we are gathering detailed information on their hazard profiles for each of the F-gases, their performance, risk considerations to human health and the environment, a socioeconomic assessment of each F-gas and their blends, and for each of their uses. The analysis of alternatives is another key aspect in which for each F-gas or blend in scope, we detailed we try to find out with your help about the existence of alternatives in the industry already or in development, or entirely different technological systems, or producing alternatives. So we are going to assess alternatives for each of the uses of F-gases that are currently identified. And then we are going to assess their socioeconomic contribution of the F-gases in scope for each of their uses. So as I mentioned, the goal is to conclude on the most appropriate risk management measure for each of the F-gases in scope, as opposed to for all of them jointly in the previous study, in the context of this consultation, in order to help the industry advocate for the best and most balanced regulatory option. Among the possible options, which is not limited in this list, but some possible options are evaluation, including harmonized classification and labeling, REACH restriction, REACH authorization, candidate listing, others, and no action is also an option. So if the current regulation of F-gases is already covering all aspects that are needed in order to attain the regulatory objectives, no action can be an option. Next slide, please. So these are the F-gases in scope of this study. They have been identified as of relevance for the EFCTC and their members, and are potentially included under the potentially included under the definition of PFAS under the restriction proposal. Of course, that can change according to the evidence that can be provided by any party interested in the consultation process. And we are covering a group of 4 HFCs and a group of 4 HCFOs. It's interesting because the last group of 4 HCFOs have much lower global warming potential and are currently considered under the F-gas regulation that is in force now as alternatives to the most contaminating HFCs that are the first 4. And they are defining the pathway to lower global warming emissions towards 2030 and 2050. So this is already something that is regulated by the European Commission. It's regulated to attain a lowering of greenhouse gas emissions. And this additional regulation would restrict both the most global warming potential F-gases and also their alternatives towards a lower emission scenario. Also, of special relevance for downstream users are blends. So it's not expected that all of you are familiar with these denominations of F-gases, but we will include what blends they're included in that you are surely aware of, that you use in your production, so that you can follow the consultation itself and provide the best possible evidence. And the uses that these F-gases are introduced in as inputs to the production are a lot of them: commercial refrigeration, air conditioning and heat pumps, mobile air conditioning, foam blowing agents in closed cell, industrial refrigeration and transport refrigeration, fire protection systems, propellants, foam blowing agent in open cell, domestic refrigeration, solvents, cover gas for magnesium casting, meter dose inhalers, foam products, and skin coolers in beauty shops. These are especially they're related to refrigeration, heat pumps, and air conditioning, used in a lot of settings, in a lot of sectors. They are used in the domestic sector, in transport, in industrial plants. So it's a wide-reaching restriction if there were no alternatives to the current uses of F-gases. Next slide, please. So among the tasks that we are developing, We have been gathering data on the F-gases and their alternatives to the extent that we can with the literature that is published, mapping information that is already available from our previous study for the socioeconomic assessment, etc. And we are developing already to some extent, the analysis of alternatives. But of course, this is incomplete without your contribution to the consultation, both from members of EFCTC as producers and importers of F-gases, and both from downstream users of these F-gases, because both sides can complement themselves and be aware of different aspects of different alternatives, etc., to the F-gases. So the best possible evidence is only to be gathered between with collaboration from both sides of the restriction. So, of course, this involves less-based research activities and the consultation. With that, we are developing the final analysis of alternatives, the socioeconomic assessment for each F-gas and its use, and finally be able to assess and to determine the best regulatory management option for each of the F-gases. And to conclude, next slide, please. So in practice, what are we after here? I'm showing here as an example for one of the HFCs in scope, HFC 125, signaled with an arrow, the final output that we are after in this analysis. We are going to compare a number of regulatory management options represented in green, regulatory management option 1, 2, up to N. And within each of those, we are including the results of the analysis of alternatives for that F-gas, the socioeconomic assessment for that F-gas, and a proportionality assessment. That results in a multidimensional assessment of various aspects that define these regulatory management options, and we will be able to give it a score. And once we have the scores of all the regulatory management options, we will be in a place to rank them and to decide on the best one for this F-gas. Within each of those elements that define the score, in the analysis of alternatives, we are assessing, of course, for each of for this F-gas in particular, for each of its uses, the alternatives that are available. In the socioeconomic assessment, building on the alternatives that have been identified, we are assessing the economic implications of a potential restriction of that F-gas. So if there are alternatives to that F-gas, we understand that production in all the applications that use it, if all the applications know about alternatives that are viable, that are feasible, and that can still maintain production, the production of the applications would be able to continue. So the socioeconomic assessment would result in a situation in which there's not much impact from the restriction of that F-gas. Otherwise, if there are no alternatives identified and both producers of this F-gas and downstream users that use this F-gas in blends or as in its pure form in their production, if no one knows about alternatives and alternatives are not known anywhere in the literature, and there is evidence that no one would know what to do, then that restriction of this HFC 125 would have a high economic impact that would help define an alternative regulatory management option. And finally, using the information both from the analysis of alternatives and from the socioeconomic assessment, we would be in a place to assess the proportionality of each of the regulatory management options, whether it's effective, if it's able to attain the regulatory objectives, whether it's necessary, or it could have been attained by an alternative regulatory option, and whether it's proportional, whether it has unintended consequences that are excessive, and that could be reduced by an alternative regulation. So that's, in summary, what we are doing in this study. So next slide, please. I'm going to go in a little more detail on what each of these parts of the analysis would entail. And after that, I will proceed to describe the consultation that will help us gather evidence to each of these steps in the analysis. So we are organizing the report by as a regulatory management option analysis for each of the F-gases. So within separate sections for each of the F-gases, we are gathering all the information related to that one, analyzing the existence of alternatives, their viability, etc., and doing this socioeconomic assessment for each of them in each of their uses, and assessing the regulatory management options considered for that gas. Then we conclude, we follow to all the rest, the remaining F-gases, and after the best regulatory management options have been determined for each of them, we will be able to assess globally what would be the conclusions and whether there is a single policy that can be defined to regulate this as a group, the F-gases. Next slide, please. So first, we are screening and mapping substance information. This is an activity that is being developed with the support of members from EFCTC. It consists mainly of gathering information on the physicochemical properties and hazard profiles of F-gases, their volumes produced and imported, and their tonnage, uses to the best of their knowledge, exposure and monitoring data in the environment and workplace and consumers if relevant, and obtaining risk characterization ratios and recommended risk reduction measures. Most of these can be gathered, well, some of these can be gathered from registration dossiers of the substances in the registration database. And other parts of this evidence are not public. And then we are asking for some private information from the industry that is supporting to gather relevant evidence to this study. Industry in any regulatory management option analysis is highly encouraged to be proactive, both from the from the producers and the downstream users, which are both considered interested parties. And industry should consider to provide or complete some of the key data provided in the dossiers, such as other up-to-date hazard profiles that identify the most relevant endpoints and impurities of relevance for the hazard profile, tonnages indicated by registrants separated between intermediate and non-intermediate uses and considering trade, uses and exposure of relevance, etc. Another end of life, final fate, and recycling considerations. That is going to link later to the information that is needed from downstream users. So this is like an introduction. Next slide, please. So after gathering all the information external to the consultation, we are moving on to the analysis of alternatives per use. This type of analysis should reflect the state of the art to avoid future challenges during public consultation. And that is why we are also asking about potential alternatives under development that are not out there yet, that are not ready for sale, but that may be under research at the moment. In a first step, we identify the key functional requirements that may force to split the analysis into different functionality groups, and that those are the applications, the different functions that the F-gases serve in different applications. And then we address other types of questions in the stakeholder consultation. For example, drivers for substitution that can be potential exposure of alternatives versus F-gases, their cost, their relative prices, and market pressures such as demand wanting to move on to different types of products or not wanting, etc. A special case has to be considered for blends. So we are asking whether they can be reformulated, for example, removing the F-gas that can be restricted, or whether they can be redesigned in order to have a similar solution that is a liquid in the way that is used now, or whether we need to move on from a blend into another entirely different system or technology. We are also asking for drivers for continued use of the current F-gases. That can be the cost of the alternatives if they are too high, like their unit prices or their performance-related cost. That can have to do with a high consumption of energy, for example. We also are interested in technical considerations related to functionality, complexity of processes, of production processes, or of the products themselves, or the production of additional impurities or waste that can also be of interest to the regulator. Also, market conditions such as consumer preferences are, to the extent possible, going to be elicited. Then we are also looking for the likelihood of an alternative becoming available. As I said, not only what exists today, but what is being developed. For example, documenting known ongoing trials for most likely to yield success to Plan B alternatives at a less mature stage, and some approximation of the time frame that one would expect them until they reach the market. Also, other criteria, such as the hazard profiles of the alternatives, are of interest to the study, because we need to justify moving on from an F-gas that is being used today to an alternative. If the objective of the regulation is reducing greenhouse gas emissions and the alternative performs worse in emissions, there has to be either other justification, or maybe it's not justified enough, or there has to be some argument. We are also asking for operational constraints linked to the process, such as whether the substance is sustainable, if it may become unavailable or depleted, or be too energy intensive, energy inefficient, emit or leak too much greenhouse gases, etc. Also, other life cycle considerations, like if the current problem of F-gases can be translated to a later stage of the production, consumption, and disposal life cycle. That is something to take into account. Another key economic elements, such as the cost itself of the alternative substance and implications to the production process, etc. And finally, this analysis of alternatives being a key element of the analysis and of what will be defining the whole assessment, is that it's credible. All evidence has to be supported either by the industry itself as a claim that can be attributed to the industry, or from other reports or studies that are well known and can be peer reviewed. Next slide, please. So moving on to the socioeconomic assessment per use, in this we are going to assess the market impacts of the alternatives on top of the economic and technical feasibility. So the socioeconomic assessment may identify consumer preferences, for instance, that will drive the market response. For example, price elasticity, opting for imports if the articles affected are not available anymore. Illicit imports can be a special case considered here if the enforcement of a restriction cannot be sufficiently developed, and others like loss of competitiveness of the European industry, etc. All these aspects are particularly interesting to explore when alternatives are already being made available to consumers. Other types of socioeconomic impacts are loss of jobs. In our socioeconomic assessment, in the previous study that we developed with EFCTC, we found that there would be, to some extent, loss of jobs if the restriction happens and there are no alternatives. And this would happen along the whole value chain, from producers of F-gases themselves to downstream users, if they lose the part of their production, and that cannot be the F-gas that is an input cannot be substituted by an alternative. There is a refinement of this socioeconomic assessment at the regulatory management option stage that will vary according to the option, to the regulatory option itself. So, for example, if the option is only indicative occupational exposure limits, there are not so many market implications, and this socioeconomic assessment requires very few arguments. In the contrary, if the regulatory management option is a restriction, we need to assess the socioeconomic impact and preferably via cost-benefit analysis. And that is why we are asking in the consultation for current cost of production and expected cost of introducing an alternative to the F-gases in scope. And similarly for an authorization. The criterion for sustainability or resilience may be interesting to explore, especially in the EU, where there are several regulatory initiatives and policy targets aimed at stimulating economic growth and job creation, and also to protect the environment, which is a key element, of course, of this regulation and this scenario. Next slide, please. So finally, we will be developing the synthesis of regulatory management options and their proportionality assessment. The RMOA is based on an initial concern regarding hazard properties or potential exposure from a substance. In this case, in particular for PFAS, it's their persistence. And for F-gases, the current F-gas regulation that is in place and its ongoing developments refer to their global warming potential. The purpose of the RMOA is to clarify whether risk management activities are required for a substance based on their existing hazard or risk information, and to identify the most appropriate instrument to address the concern. Some risk management measures include evaluation. For example, an RMOA may come to a conclusion that additional information needs to be generated in order to know more about the substance and its implications. Harmonized classification and labeling is another one. Restriction, which is the one in the proposal. Inclusion in a candidate list, such as selection as SVHC. And this one is the first step towards prioritization for authorization and the REACH. And other options like occupational exposure limits, environmental quality standards, etc. Next slide, please. So this step builds on information that was already gathered and analyzed on the analysis of alternatives and the socioeconomic assessment, and will involve assessing the regulatory management options considered for each F-gas in terms of their effectiveness, that is their ability to eliminate risk or to reduce it as a second best, their measurability and monitorability. If that is not reliable enough, the ability to reduce risk will not be reliable either, and whether there are proven technologies available to attain this. It will also be assessed in terms of their practicability, like the easiness to implement by the industry, by regulators, and time to implementation, which are both all of them important and often disregarded, and the necessity and regulatory consistency with other EU legislation, which, as I mentioned, is not entirely clear, why being already regulation by for the F-gases, with a future pathway well defined, whether it would make sense to include them in a restriction while developments are being made at the moment in that regulation. So finally, we would obtain a multidimensional ranking of regulatory management options in which they can be assessed, recommended, or discarded considering their proportionality, which was this last analysis. So finally, we would be able to conclude about the suitability of a restriction for each of the F-gases in scope, or recommend an alternative regulatory management option among the ones that we analyzed, if it's deemed more appropriate, for example, a derogation. Next slide, please. Next. So in the consultation that we are developing, as a general description, this is going to kick off in November 14th. That is not next Monday, but the following Monday, and will last for 8 weeks. We are going to gather all the information that I've been describing now for each of the steps of the exercise. And there are going to be 2 types of survey. One for all previous participants who already participated in the socioeconomic assessment, which is going to have a more reduced set of questions, already relying on the information that was provided before, and a longer survey for new participants, which we are very much interested to gather. And that questionnaire will have around 70 queries between qualitative and quantitative. There is a set of first questions that will filter the information that needs to be filled in later. So that will help with fatigue, hopefully. We are aiming to target a diverse range of members from SMEs to large companies and different downstream using sectors, among all the applications that I mentioned before. And it will be, of course, be anonymous. All the submitted data will be covered by NDAs to be confirmed before completion of the survey within the own questionnaire. And CEPIC or the EFCTC will not have access to the data submitted whatsoever. Of course, this type of analysis relies a lot on best guesses and expectations, educated guesses, etc. Since it is an assessment of something that may happen in the future, and that is a situation not entirely known by anyone, the best possible source of evidence that we have at the moment is the industry itself, that may be more aware than anyone of the possibilities of alternatives at this point. The questions are going to be, most of them, multiple choice primarily, and will provide ranges where relevant. When there are numeric responses, we will be offering different ranges to provide for ease and for reference. The input from associations, industry associations, for example, will be valuable also for our side. And incomplete responses are also appreciated. If there is some part of the assessment that is completely unknown and impossible to determine for you, a partial response is also going to be used. But of course, the key element of interest for us is the analysis of alternatives and the extent of your knowledge about alternatives, their cost, their practicability, etc. This survey is going to require some multidisciplinary collaboration, and that will require contacting colleagues and teams from across the business, and to ask other people in different departments to develop best guesses and expert opinion. For example, it can be colleagues in the regulatory affairs teams, in finance, in strategy units, product development, R&D, and etc. And we will include extensive guidance in all the questions, guidance as to who might be better placed to respond within a company, as to exactly what is the scope of the question, what are the limits, the boundaries, etc. So hopefully it will be super clear in the survey. Next slide, please. So both there are two surveys, one for producers and importers and other for downstream users of F-gases. For producers and importers, we are asking everything from the perspective of someone that is a registrant of F-gases, that produces an HFC or HCFO of the ones that I showed you before. And we are going to ask about the turnover or revenue attributed to the sales of each of those F-gases in scope in the European Economic Area in 2019. All the questions are going to be referring to 2019 because, of course, 2020 was not a very reliable year. It was an atypical year due to the pandemic. And 2021 is not yet considered a representative year. So that is why we are staying in 2019. And of course, 2022 is not yet over. And for producers and importers, the sales of F-gases includes the revenue that comes from blends containing those F-gases. We are interested in knowing how that revenue can be distributed among each of the F-gases or can be attributed to each of the F-gases, because of course we are going to assess the impacts of the restriction to each of them separately. So that is something to start considering, that we need all the information, if possible, split by each of the F-gases. Then we are also asking about applications or uses to which each of those F-gases are sold to the best of their knowledge. And that is going to be the list of applications that I showed you before. And also, as basic descriptive questions for the current situation are going to be the key functions that each of those F-gases in scope provide in each of the applications that they are sold to. The functions can be refrigeration, isolation, etc. Then we move on to the analysis of alternatives for each F-gas in scope in each of their applications or uses. And we are going to be asking about awareness of existence of other chemical alternatives to F-gases and their blends, material changes within the chemical sphere that can be done in the production using other chemicals that are not in scope of the restriction, some knowledge of ongoing research and broad status of any known developments, and willingness to produce alternatives within the current business scope of the respondents. Then we are going to ask about the cost of alternatives to the best of their knowledge, the ability to meet current demand, and whether entirely different technologies or systems can be used as an alternative, and whether their cost, an idea of their cost in comparison to the current production of F-gases. For those, we are going to assess the performance, their energy consumption, and some assessment of their global warming potential, although we are going to do that also ourselves with the help from the literature and other sources. And also their human hazard, physical hazard, and environmental hazard profiles, whether those are lower, higher, or equal to the ones for F-gases. And finally, we are asking some questions to develop an exposure assessment for each F-gas in scope in each of their applications during manufacture and use. We are going to ask about exposure pathways, such as human health and environment, and mitigation measures to reduce exposure. Next slide, please. So for downstream users, the structure is going to be very similar, but of course we need to know their perspective, which is from a different place in the value chain from the use of F-gases. We are asking at the point of production, manufacture, and import of F-gases, and for downstream users, we are going to ask at the point of using those F-gases in the form of blends or in pure form in their production of equipment of many different types. Those are the refrigeration equipment, air conditioning, etc. that I showed you before. So the basic questions are going to be in the form of the turnover or revenue attributed to the sales of products, mixtures or articles that contain the F-gases in scope or the blends containing them in the EA in 2019. That is, for example, heat pump equipments. A proper indication to what blends can be considered under each of the F-gases in scope is going to be included to serve as a guidance, because we understand that you may not be familiar with HFCs or F-gases themselves, but you must be familiar with the blends that you actually use and purchase as inputs. Then we are also asking about applications that your production is used in. The applications that contain, of course, each of those F-gases in scope by each of those F-gases, and with proper indication again to what blends. That is going to be indicated in all questions for reference. And finally, we are asking the key functions, just as in the producer survey, that each of the F-gases in scope and their blends provide in each of the applications that they are sold to, the applications that you develop as manufacturers. In the analysis of alternatives, we are asking about awareness again of the existence of other chemical alternatives to F-gases that you may be able to use in your production as in substitution of the blends that you use as refrigerants and others. We are going to ask also about material changes that can be developed or used that come from within the chemical sphere, and ongoing research and broad status of any non-developments, and willingness to produce alternatives within current business scope yourselves. We are also asking about the cost, the ability to meet current product demand with the use of those alternatives, and about the availability of entirely different technologies or systems to be developed as alternative, and their costs. Then we move on to performance, energy consumption, global warming potential, and hazard profiles. And finally, we conclude with the assessment of exposure. Next slide, please. So the questions and the survey is going to look like this. In this question that I included in this presentation as example is we are asking about the turnover that can be attributed to the sales of each of the F-gases in scope that one respondent produces or imports. We indicate here in bullets that these sales volumes refer to 2019 and that refer to sales only in the EEA, in the European Economic Area. And that they should consider both F-gases in their basic form and as part of blends. For example, if the full turnover value from sales of blends or blends containing F-gases in scope. If a blend contains, this is for the clarification for the question. If a blend contains more than one of the F-gases, all of them are necessary for the viability of that blend. We have to introduce the value of that blend as sales value under each of the F-gases that this respondent produces. And this is how it's asked for producers or importers. And in the circle here, I introduced the different wording that we are using to ask downstream users. So we are asking what is the turnover that can be attributed to sales of products, mixers or articles containing each of the F-gases in scope or their blends. We are going to indicate for each of the F-gases what blends are the commonly used for that contain each of those F-gases. That will be what you're familiar with. And also indicating all the guidance to have the bounds of the question correctly assessed. And I show you here how you have drop-down menus to select from ranges for this turnover, and this is going to be more or less how the survey is going to look. Next slide, please, and I'll show you some more examples. this one is one of the first questions that serves as a filter to the remaining of the survey. So we are asking respondents to select all the applications and uses that each of the F-gases that they produce. In the first column are the F-gases that they are selling to or aware of. So if one is a producer, manufacturer, or importer of HFC 134A, they may select that this is used to the best of their knowledge in commercial refrigeration, stationary air conditioning and heat pumps, and mobile air conditioning. And for another respondent who, well, or the same respondent who produces or imports HFO 1234YF, they may be aware that this one is used in foam blowing agent, and in fire protection. This table is also going to be included in a question for downstream users, but with a different wording that takes into account the different perspective for downstream users in a different position in the value chain. That is, to select all the applications and uses in which you sell products, mixtures, or articles that contain F-gases, including in the form of blends, and to the extent that you are aware. And next slide, please. And a final example, in this one, we assess exposure pathways of concern for the F-gases in scope during both manufacture and use. So in this part of the question, we are selecting exposure pathways related to the environment, exposure pathways related to human health in the following column, and in an open text box, which there are going to be a few in the questionnaire, we are asking for any known mitigation measures that the company is taking to reduce exposure. From the selected exposure pathways in the selected HFC, in this case 134A, in the selected application, that is in this case commercial refrigeration. And you will be able to select this and to determine all this information for each of the F-gases that you produce, import, or use as a downstream user in each of the applications that are of your concern. Next slide, please. And finally, for new participants, we are also gathering some additional information that help us define the current scenario and what would happen in a restriction. So we are asking a number of baselining questions, such as the annual turnover, total turnover of the company, and the turnover of the sales of products, mixtures, or articles that contain the F-gases in scope jointly. And in this case, it's not by F-gas. And this baseline is going to be determined from now to a decade's time. So we are asking about some expectations of how this will grow, the company's expectations in the scenario where no restriction is happening. That's a scenario only with the current F-gas regulation in force. And we are also asking this baseline information and some information in the scenario in which the restriction happens. For example, how much would you expect your overall capital investment in the EEA to change on average on the 10-year period after the implementation of the restriction on the manufacturer placing on the market and use compared to 2019? This is general, more aggregate information without being split by each of the F-gases, but that will help us define the global situation in which all the F-gases are restricted. And then with the individual assessments that I've shown you in the previous questions, we will be able to assess all the intermediate situations. I explained here that these are example questions for new participants because these were exactly the ones that we assessed in the socioeconomic assessment study that we developed and that we finalized recently. So these questions are going to come up filtered for participants that were already in the socioeconomic assessment questionnaire, and they will show up for new participants. Next slide, please. And this is all on my side. I'm open to all questions.
Thank you, Inge. Maybe before jumping off onto the questions, just a little tiny summary of the things that I would like you to remember after today's webinar. So first of all, there is going to be a stakeholder survey connected to this RMOA exercise. The survey will start on the 14th of November, and then it will run for 8 weeks until the 9th of January of next year. There will be 2 questionnaires. One is for manufacturers and producers of F-gases, while the other one is for downstream users. Here in the slides, there is the link to request the questionnaire, because of course you will receive it via email if you request it. You can actually fill in both if that is the case for your company or association. Connected to the survey, you will be asked to sign an NDA. It will be signed between whoever decides to respond and the Ricardo team. If you have already responded to the SEA survey and you have signed an NDA for that survey, then you don't need to sign a second one. Then again, as Inge has already mentioned, the ones of you who have already provided a contribution to the socioeconomic assessment survey will have less questions to answer this time around. So I hope that this was useful. Then again, if you have any questions that we don't manage to answer today, you will receive these slides, the link to request a questionnaire, and our contact details in an email right after the webinar. So you are more than welcome to contact us and ask any questions that you are not able to ask today.